Welcome to Father and Son. Welcome to you, Tom.
Good to be here, Dad.
Well, I was on Q&A earlier this week, and the subject I wanted to talk about with the boat people. What's your hit on it?
Well, I enjoyed watching that episode of Q&A last Monday night. I think it's a good program. I like the relatively unscripted nature of it. Obviously, boat people is a big political issue at the moment. It's one of those hot topics that Gillard is trying to defuse prior to an election, which, as we know, could be called any time.
But she doesn't seem to have been able to do that.
Well, I think Julia Gillard suffers from the same problems that Kevin Rudd had, which is you think of an idea, you suddenly announce it without having thought it through. So it's just, you think
well, she obviously hadn't talked to the right people up there, and as you said last week, it's not a safe place according to the Department of Foreign Affairs.
Well, this is East Timor. They've gone and suggested East Timor as a refugee processing centre. We have several hundred Australian troops there, and the Foreign Affairs Department says it's not a safe place for Australians to travel, and yet, curiously, it's supposed to be okay to send war-torn refugees. So it's astonishing. And would you believe, Nauru has come out today and said, actually, we'd happily sign the UN Refugee Convention if you would like to reopen the wonderful centre that already exists on their island.
Yeah, which Australia built.
Yes, we built.
And obviously, if you go to East Timor, you've got to build another one.
Oh, but of course, it wasn't Australia that built it. It was John Howard that built it, and therefore it can't be used. Look, I think the points you made, Deb, and I think are in line with what the bulk of Australians think, that we don't, I think, have a problem accepting refugees. There's always a debate about the number, just as there is about the total number of migrants, which includes refugees, but it's the manner in which they come here. Given that Australia will never ever be able to resettle even a fraction of the people who would like to come here, we should, the ones that we do accept, we should do in an orderly manner. And of course, the other issue about boat people or asylum seekers is that we are condemning many of them to death, because the more that we encourage them to come by boat, the more will drown inevitably on the crossing. And that is a humanitarian disaster.
Well, the Australian people don't want them coming by boat and want a proper process put in place. What I suggested on Q&A the other night was, if there are all these thousands in camps in Indonesia, which there are, why don't we send teams of people up there from the Department of Immigration and pick the eyes out of them, say we'll take 10,000 of those, and then the people who are in these camps, who are the ones who jump on the boat, say, oh, we've got a much better chance of getting to Australia if we go through an orderly process.
Now, I mean, obviously you have to work out the details of how you do it, but they would see that some people who have spent some time in the camp are now getting resettled in Australia, and that would hopefully demotivate them from getting on a boat. In fact, especially if they saw people who had got on a boat being sent back and told, well, you're now back to the end of the queue. So, look, it's an emotive issue. It's one that rationality always seems to go out the window whenever it comes up. I do think politically Gillard made a major miscalculation by suggesting East Timor. And the Minister for Immigration, who was sitting next to you, you pointed out quite correctly that the East Timorese Parliament had said they weren't that interested in the idea. And he said, we're not worried about what the Parliament says. Well, imagine if someone said that about Australia. We don't care what the Australian Parliament says. I mean, it shows a certain arrogance towards the issue, which I think, again, it looks very bad for the government.
Yeah, except it is a bit more like the US system, where the President has executive power and the White House is separate from the Parliament.
Well, I can tell you in the US, even if you did a deal with the President, the Congress gets a look at it, and if the Congress says they don't want to do it, it doesn't get done.
Exactly. Well, on the wider front, I did say again, I think the election will be called in the next 2 weeks, either this weekend coming up or the weekend after. To do that, that means she can have the election in August. She won't want the election in September because of all the football finals. Her next opportunity is October, and I don't think she'll delay that long, because that would require her to come back into the Parliament. The Parliament will sit again in the beginning of September if an election hasn't been called. And I think it's 30 to 33 days, somewhere about that the election has to run. So if she's going to have an October election, she's going to call early September, but I bet you can have a really good bet on it that she'll announce it either this weekend or next weekend. And the other thing that tells you that is the Governor General is going to spend 2 weeks overseas.
She's coming back.
Goodness knows why, what she's doing, wasting our money, but she's only going to spend a week. She'll be home both weekends.
Yeah, look, the betting in the financial markets is for the 21st or 28th of August. That's done by elimination. You've got the races in October. They don't want to clash with that. The football finals in September. It starts, as you say, they probably
don't. Victorian election in November.
You don't want to run into the state election. So I agree with you that the second last or last weekend in August is the most likely one. The polls suggest it's going to be close. Two-party preferred 52-48 in favour of Labor at the moment. But those polls are done nationally. I think when you look at the marginal seats, it could be extraordinarily close.
Well, I think the other thing, Gary Morgan, who we've had on this show, said that his polling shows that of the Democrat vote, which now stands at about 13%, last election about 80% of the preferences went to the Labor Party. He says at the moment it's 69-70.
So you mean the Green vote?
Green vote,
yeah,
sorry.
The Democrats have pretty much disappeared.
Democrats are gone, sorry. The Green vote. And now that 10% difference is equal to 1.3% of the two-party preferred, which would make them almost level.
Well, I would be surprised if a lot of Green voters did shift towards preferencing the Liberal Party. One of the things about the preferential system is it really doesn't matter where you put them, it's just who you put higher than the other. So if you put Labor second last and the Liberals last, then you are still preferencing Labor. It's one of those things I'm not sure everybody really understands.
Well, but the difference this time is I think the Liberal Party has some leverage, and the preferences are done on a state basis by all the parties, so it's not something the federal government or the federal opposition can do. They can try and influence. But like you've raised the point of the seat of Melbourne, which provided the Liberals preference the Greens could win that seat.
Oh, definitely.
Now, why should the Liberal Party give the preference to the Greens if they don't get something in return? I think there's a few seats. I think there's one in New South Wales, one in South Australia, whereby the Greens wanting the Liberal Party preference, the Liberals have to get something back.
And the Greens desperately would love genuine lower house representation. They know that inner city seats in Melbourne and Sydney are the best way to get it. And you're quite right, on a state-by-state basis, they might say, well, the price for guaranteeing the Greens winning the seat in Melbourne is perhaps a split ticket or something like that.
Well, no, they've had split tickets in the past. I think what the Liberals got to do in this state of Victoria is say, you give us the preferences and we'll preference you.
Well, both parties did knock back the government's ETS legislation, so they've got that in common, don't they?
All right, well, it's going to be another interesting week in politics. When we join you next week, the election may have been called, and then it's going to be on. And I think, whoever runs their election campaign the best has a real chance of winning. And running it the best means no gaffes. Now, she's had her big gaff with the boat people, so it's going to be very interesting to see how both Abbott and the Prime Minister go. People will be watching, and a lot of people don't make up their mind until they walk into that ballot box. See you next week.